you, Pat. I'm going to kind of ask you first the question so the audience could get to know you, is how you got into the position that you are today.
Hello, Alex. Thanks for inviting me. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, loud and clear.
Okay. Well, I'm 34, close to 35-year veteran of the RCMP, and for the last over 6 years now, I've been operating in the anti-corruption sphere, where my role is varied. I'm a senior investigator, so I work specifically with the Sensitive and International Investigation Unit, the RCMP, which deals with international and financial sensitive investigations. But my area of expertise is actually anti-corruption and compliance. So I'm the anti-corruption and compliance expert for the RCMP.
Perfect. Since you kind of have this expertise, I wanted to kind of get you to touch base on the relevance of these e-tools that we have in your day-to-day dealings and investigations.
Well, these tools, any compliance tools today is critical. If you look at how the business environment is operating across the world, there's a huge increase in enforcement action against corruption in multiple jurisdictions, whether it's G20 countries or even developing countries. So it is critical today for any company who wish to operate in either high-risk jurisdiction or even low-risk jurisdiction to have a robust compliance program. So a E-Series or any other compliance program from various reliable sources are critical today for any company to get involved in. One of the things that's important to remember for companies is because of this increased enforcement action, in certain jurisdictions, whether it's the UK, whether it's the United States, and even in a lot of growing and development countries, the fact that, like the Section 7, like in the UK, a company must be able to have a robust compliance program to be able to protect themselves from enforcement action.
Okay, great. Now, maybe kind of touching on I know kind of enforcement program is great on a national level, but can you touch a little bit on the need from a global perspective and kind of what compliance measures you see are critical from a globalization and global perspective?
Okay, well, let me share my screen here with you, okay?
Perfect. Let's just verify.
You got it? You see it?
One moment.
You got it?
Try one more time, just to share. One moment.
No,
we're going to put you in presenter mode first. So
okay.
Just bear with us for one moment.
Okay. Well, you know what? I have a technical glitch on my end, so don't worry about it. We just continue on.
Okay. You know what? I'm going to share. I'm going to open it on our end. So if you maybe want to just bear with me too, I'll open it right now. Perfect. So, okay. Perfect. So feel free and just, tell me next slide and we can move it on from there, okay?
Okay. If you can just put it to the first text slide, enforcement and compliance. Sure. I've totally lost access to the webinar, so I'm using my phone, which is a good thing because my computer crashed. Okay.
Yeah.
So,
okay, it's good to have a backup. Awesome.
Okay.
Thank you.
So let's look at it from the perspective of the fact that one of the key of enforcement action today is that it's been evolving. And where in the past, a lot of jurisdiction were going after just the companies themselves. Now you've got the UK, the US, us, and other jurisdictions that are not just going after companies, but going after the individuals. So when you look at the compliance program today, where a company can demonstrate clearly that they have done their utmost, they have a robust compliance program, that they've done all possible to be able to prevent it, they're more likely from a enforcement perspective where the enforcement agency will go after the individuals instead of the company. Now, you know that in the UK, the US, and other jurisdictions, not having a compliance program is actually a chargeable offense, if you wish, especially in the UK.
Okay.
In the US, you've got credit. So basically, it's in today's business environment and in today's enforcement environment, not having a compliance program is a detriment to any company. And it's becoming so that having a robust compliance program now is a competitive business advantage. So you have to look at it from the legal risk management aspect in terms of enforcement action, because you have much stronger enforcement actions all over the world. But also from a regulatory perspective is that the companies will get credit, even in Canada. Now, depending on the cases, we will look at
looks like we are waiting to just mute. Okay, so we're just going to
Hello?
Yeah, you're back on.
Oh, okay.
So essentially you were speaking about kind of when you're doing investigations, the notion that these programs that are in place that you give them credit for.
Well, credit, you have to be careful because it's not a strict policy. It all depends on each case. But one of the roles that I and my colleague have that work in the outreach sector is that we evaluate the robustness of a compliance program when we investigate a case. Okay? So having a company being able to demonstrate clearly that they've done their utmost to prevent this from occurring in the first place has huge impact and mitigating factor in terms of how we're going to be looking at the case and bringing charges forward either on the company or the individuals. Okay.
Very good. So it plays a very critical role in investigations and risk mitigation. So
absolutely. It's essential today. It's essential today.
I kind of want to get a little more kind of from a practical perspective. In our e-resource, we do have a chapter on Latin America. Do you think you can briefly kind of touch, I know recently you did a training in Colombia, so kind of the relevance of our chapter and your training?
Well, I was invited by Global Affairs Canada and a university in Colombia to go and basically share the best practices that we have in Canada. Not to tell them what to do, is basically share some of the lessons learned, if you wish. Because Colombia is now that they've negotiated peace with FARC, they're looking for a peace dividend. And there's a pushback from civil society to deal more effectively with corruption issues. So what transpired out of this is that I represented the RCMP and I also represented the Canadian Centre of Excellence for Anti-Corruption, where there's a huge appetite in Colombia, and I'm sure in other countries in Latin America that Felix will be able to talk about, for stronger measures, stronger controls, more ethical governance measures to be implemented within the government institution and within companies. So they're pushing forward with a lot of transparency measures, with a lot of accountability measures. And in Colombia, with the new laws, they actually they provide credit for those companies that have a compliance program. So again, it is a business advantage for any company operating in Colombia to have a compliance program. It is critical for those industry players that are looking in investing in doing their legal risk management, entering these type of markets, that if they don't have a compliance program, it's not when they're going to be approached for a bribe. It's not if they're going to be approached for a bribe, it's when. So having this in mind, they must be able to have the strong controls and the strong compliance in place. So what GNC, your ebook and other tools that are available from various sources are critical for those companies to implement, because if they don't have that, this is where they're going to get in trouble, whether from the criminal prosecutor perspective or just from civil liability as well. So these actions in Colombia, what is interesting is that there's a huge appetite to change the culture, the business culture, how government deals with foreign investors. So knowing this and a company entering this market not having a compliance program is extremely detrimental to their reputation and their liability.
Great. So I think that's very good. It's nice to know that they're making strides, and that kind of this e-resource is kind of a nice, could set up kind of doing business in places in Latin America. So that's awesome. I want to kind of stop you there and thank you so much.
Okay.
And kind of taking the technical from your computer crashing, so we appreciate you kind of sticking on, which is awesome.
Not a problem.
Going to go back. It looks like Jonathan, we've been able to connect. So I would love to have Jonathan to give us kind of an overview of the purpose of the chapters, as well as kind of the regional nature of them as well.
Yeah, no, appreciate that, and apologies, I also have my own technical difficulties in getting in, obviously. Yeah, so look, let me talk a little bit about the ebook project and how that came about, and for some of you, that'll obviously be a bit of a reminder, and Pat as well has worked very closely on that project. Let me talk a little bit about the chapters and how they fit in, and really where we come at this. You know, as we think about corruption, it's become, and Pat certainly alluded to this, a global focus. And it's not just for enforcement activities, although that is a critically important part of it. When we think about corruption and we look at it in a larger context, it's identified widely as a leading driver of poverty, of conflict. It degrades communities. It hinders economic development, particularly in developing countries. It undermines the rule of law. It deters investment, local and international investment. It ultimately creates a vicious cycle that prevents communities from advancing. With all of these harms in mind, Principle 10 of the 10 principles of the Global Compact and the SDGs, including SDG 16, promoting peaceful, just, and inclusive societies, both identify corruption as a key issue that should be addressed by government, business, civil society, international institutions, and really all social actors. And so it's with that spirit in mind that we created the ebook last year. And it's really designed to focus on businesses and what businesses can do as part of that commitment to eradicate corruption on a global basis. And Pat, as he always does, eloquently identified enforcement risks, not only to companies and to employees, but we also are now increasingly seeing, as the fight against corruption has truly grown to a global level, additional activities besides just enforcement, and that's besides enforcement by the United States under the FCPA, the UK under with the Serious Fraud Office under the UK Bribery Act, and of course Pat and his team with the RCMP in Canada. We're seeing countries now seize properties and refuse to renew licenses as part of nationalization efforts and to eliminate what they see as unethical companies from operating within their borders. It's creating difficulties for companies to access capital and financing from lending institutions who are also looking into history of corruption and ethical behavior. It's causing acquisitions and mergers to fall apart as diligence is done on counterparties and targets where you do identify concerns around corruption. So the consequences are not only serious for companies in the sense of of potential criminal and civil enforcement actions, but also in their commercial dealings and also in their ability to maintain a security for their property overseas. So understanding those potential risks as well as the obligation, responsibility of companies to participate in eradicating corruption, the ebook was created, and it has 9 chapters that are designed to help companies deter and detect corruption. Now, this includes, and this is the first phase, the larger ebook, policies and procedures, chapters on structuring your compliance program and some of the expectations and obligations associated with that. Tone from the top, and what does that mean, and how do you achieve it? Training approaches, and effective training approaches. How do you conduct risk assessments? Managing third parties. Testing your program, including from a finance and books and records standpoint, and a financial controls standpoint, and other key components of a global anti-corruption program. And this book was written by leading thinkers in the anti-corruption space in Canada from a number of different disciplines, from companies, from law firms, from accounting firms, from consultancies. And the focus of this ebook is on practicality. It isn't designed to be a theoretical approach, but one that is hands-on and practical. It has samples. It has examples. It's designed in some respects to be a plug-and-play. Here is a sample anti-corruption policy. And if you're a smaller company, you can simply take and use as part of your anti-corruption program. If you're a larger company, the ebook is designed as well to help provide not only a checklist, make sure you're conducting your affairs consistent with what leading thinkers are identifying as best practice, but also as a way to help introduce newer employees or potentially affiliates or subsidiaries that are newer to the anti-corruption space into understanding on a practical level how it is an anti-corruption program can effectively be rolled out. So while it is created with an eye towards companies that have less mature programs or those that are looking to build up a specific area of a program that hasn't yet fully developed, it's also useful for bigger companies as well for a number of different reasons. Now, that was phase 1. And of course, this webinar is focusing on phase 2 of this project, which is looking at specific jurisdictions, 4 jurisdictions where it is difficult to conduct operations as a company and where the risks of corruption are high, and some of the challenges that I noted at the outset continue to go on fairly aggressively. So the segue from the first part of the project to the second is designing a program and figuring out how you can structure it and how you can create the components of a program is obviously very important, but really the test comes when you have to implement it. And implementing it in difficult jurisdictions is where it truly gets measured in terms of its effectiveness and its ability for you to deter and detect and prevent corruption. And so focusing on high-risk jurisdictions, high-risk areas, each one of these areas that we focus on, whether it's Eastern Europe or the Middle East, Africa, they have different nuances and laws and customs and enforcement patterns. Your risk in one jurisdiction is going to be very different from your risk in another jurisdiction, and these chapters are designed to help introduce readers to what those risks are. Obviously, this isn't going to be a comprehensive assessment of everything one needs to know when they operate in, for instance, an African country, but it is designed to provide a first step towards understanding the nature of risks and how your program then can evolve to address those risks when you are operating in a challenging place. And to underscore some of the points that Pat made, you know, a lot of prosecutions and enforcement actions, and if you want to use prosecutions and enforcement actions as a proxy for corrupt activity and the difficulty of businesses operating in some of these jurisdictions, you can pull out some of the countries from the areas that are discussed in the various chapters, and you'll see there have been 57 FCPA, U.S. FCPA enforcement actions in Nigeria alone, as an African country. Moving to the Middle East, there have been 45 enforcement actions under the FCPA in Iraq. 28 in Russia if we're looking at Eastern Europe, 24 in Argentina if we're looking in South or Latin America. So these are difficult regions. You see the patterns of corruption continuing, and it's really in these places that having the strongest programs and a program that does include the elements that we've been talking about, and as Pat has identified, is so critical from the enforcement standpoint and also from some of the other areas that we've talked about in terms of development and poverty alleviation. It's these areas where this strong program becomes particularly important. Now, as a final note, I'll say that there are obviously many more difficult jurisdictions in the world where Canadian businesses operate, besides those that are discussed in these 4 chapters. But first, a lot of these lessons that are seen here are transferable to other places. A lot of the patterns you see here you do find in other places. And second, these kinds of things can be used, these chapters can be used as a source of learning, regardless of where you do operate. So we hope that the ebook itself as a resource and the subsequent 4 chapters, the 4 most recent chapters, are a resource for companies regardless of where the company might operate. And we hope that it will help eliminate corruption globally and keep our people and businesses out of harm's way. With that, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Jonathan. I think you've really emphasized the importance and the practical nature of the resource, as well as specifically the regional chapters as well, so thank you. I'm going to kind of go back to specific examples, and I wanted to introduce Susan from Partnership Africa Canada. We are so grateful to have you on. I wanted to let the audience to get to know you a bit, and just how did you get into the position you are today?
Yes, can you hear me well?
Yes, we can.
Very good. Well, thank you for having me. I am the president of the board of Partnership Africa Canada, and I also sit on the board of Transparency International Canada. But before that, I actually spent 20 years working with the International Secretariat of Transparency International, where I worked mostly on issues of corporate integrity and transparency. So I'm not new to the anti-corruption field. Yeah. I'm now involved with a research organization, conference board, that looking at areas of governance, compliance, and risk. So that's my sort of path to being with you today.
Wow, that's awesome. Yeah, lots of knowledge. So specifically, I wanted to learn a little bit of Partnership Canada-Africa and what they do, just so we can give the audience some context to the next question. Yeah.
Yes, I'd be happy to do that. Well, but first of all, before I start, I just wanted to congratulate the UNGC and the participants of the ebook. I think it's a great resource for Canadian companies, and I think that anything that helps sort of promote harmonized standards in this area will be very helpful. Even if they're soft standards, I think it's tremendously helpful, and I congratulate all those who participated in that effort. I think it's a very good tool, and hopefully it will be helpful to companies of all sizes.
Wow, thanks.
But let's go back to Partnership Africa Canada. PAC, as we call it, is a nonprofit organization that's been in operation for a little over 3 decades. And our main aim is to sort of support sustainable development in Africa. And we do this through the lens of conflict minerals. So we're looking at conflict natural resources. So we're looking at uncovering the root causes of conflict that often erupts because of the mismanagement of natural resources. And we do that by, some of the participants in the webinar may know us because of our involvement many years ago with conflict diamonds. And we were one of the initiators of the Kimberley process, which was set up to stem the flow of conflict diamonds. And we have then extended our initiatives to other minerals. Our approach is one of obviously policy work and research work, but also practical work. And we are a multi-stakeholder initiative. We'll work with communities, so civil society, governments, and industry, We choose our partners carefully, but we work with all of them. And our aim is to provide guidance on developing and putting in place programs that will promote transparent and legal supply chains, because there are big problems in Africa and other parts of the world in legalizing supply chains. And the illegal supply chains are often being fueled, are often fueling conflict. So that's one of our main aims. We also monitor the implementation of certification for conflict-prone minerals, and we support the formalization of the artisanal mining sector in the Great Lake region. And some of you may have seen in the Globe and Mail a couple of articles that were focusing on our Just Gold project in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And we were also in the news recently because our executive director brought back from the DRC about 12 ounces of gold that was produced within our Just Gold project, which is a formalized supply chain of artisanal gold. And this gold was brought to a jeweler in Canada, the Fairtrade Jewelry Company, where they fabricated rings with this gold, which is completely traceable. So it's a big achievement for us, and it demonstrates that formalizing artisanal supply chains can be done. So in a nutshell, that's the work of Partnership Africa-Canada. Hello?
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, we were just muting and unmuting here. So great work. I think this is a good segue too, because we have a chapter on Africa in the ebook, and I wanted to ask, from your experience, kind of, do you see the importance when it comes to due diligence and the notion of transparency?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's self-evident to say that you know, due diligence is essential for any business, but especially so in countries where corruption is endemic or very entrenched, and that's often the case in Africa. I mean, one of the challenges with due diligence in Africa is that it can be more cumbersome, because more difficult, because it's more difficult to access information, because often it's not as formalized in those countries. It nevertheless remains imperative, and you know, it's something that you can't bypass. You have to do it. What is, I think, encouraging is that there are resources for companies to help them share the workload and the cost of due diligence. We're seeing, for instance, that in our experience, there's a sort of collective action initiative by companies that are sourcing conflict-free minerals. They've created the Conflict-Free Smelter Initiative, which has an audit process that validates compliant smelters. And the audits include assessments of risks such as bribery, fraud, illicit payments, etc. So there are resources out there for companies that are doing this in more problematic countries. One of the barriers that we see to due diligence, and this is an area, something that we're working on very intensely at the moment, is the transparency of the ultimate beneficial owner of companies. It's a big barrier to finding out who is the real owner of companies. And although, you know, numbered companies are not always used for corrupt purposes, they often are. And it's really important to know who actually is the owner, who is your business partner in the end when you're a company. If you're acquiring a company or thinking of working with a company, you really want to know who's behind that company. So this is a particular problem in Africa, but also in developing countries. And it is, I think, a key opportunity to reduce the opportunity for corruption. And I think this approach and the issue of beneficial ownership is raised in the ebook, which is very positive from our perspective. I think an additional point is that due diligence is a process. It's not a one-off. And I'm sure there are companies listening to this who could speak to that better than me, but this idea of vetting and forgetting is not going to cut it. It is a continuous process. It has to be done repeatedly. You can't just do it once and then think that it's been done forever. It is time-consuming. It is it is a burden for companies, but it's absolutely essential. And again, there are resources and help out there for companies to do this better, but it has to be seen as a continuous process.
Great, Susan. So thank you. As you can see from a company whose kind of goal is to prevent these cases, that this resource is definitely useful, so thank you. Next, we have Felix from Global Affairs Canada. And to kind of keep with the theme and get the audience to know you, I was curious on how you got into the position that you have today as a trade commissioner.
Oh, hi, Alex.
Hello.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay. Yes, I've been here for a while now, and I've worked with the Corporate Social Responsibility Unit at Global Affairs Canada, and we are a unit that supports basically changes in behavior of companies and also a perception of these Canadian companies working abroad.
Cool. Okay, am I muted? Okay, great. So that's wonderful. So it's nice that you can kind of see the changes. So I'm curious to you, kind of, again, to keep with the theme of this webinar and launch our e-series, do you see the relevance to use an e-tool like this in your everyday work?
Oh, yes. Well, first, second, yes, I would like to thank the Global Compact Network Canada and the other panelists, too, for promoting this very relevant tool on the fight against corruption. Actually, do you want me to share my screen?
If you could share your screen, that would be great. And if not, yeah, let's just try that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And perfect. And then can you see?
Let me.
Can you see my screen now?
Maybe if you mark him as presenter, Carlisle? You did? Okay.
Felix, make sure under the WebEx meeting, you're under Quick Start and you opt to share your screen.
Okay. Yes.
Now we can see it. Perfect.
Okay. So if I can see here. Okay. Yes, the Trade Commissioner Service plays an important role in the fight against corruption around the world, because every day we include tools like this or even others like Resist from Transparency International in our work, in our everyday work. Tools like this, like designing a compliance program, it's fundamental in offering our services. I want to mention that the Trade Commissioner Service Network is part of the Global Affairs Canada, and it's present in 100 or over 160 cities worldwide, and that includes our offices across Canada. Our mandate is to help companies to export, partner, or invest abroad, and we also assist in making Canada an investment destination for foreign investors. Trade commissioners are located at Canadian embassies, consulates, and other satellite offices abroad, and they provide businesses with market facts, market reports, and other valuable information about the market, country, or regions where they are located. Some of the services we offer, or some of the services that we offer, yes, include also this tool. And as you can see on my screen, this is how we help also companies. Now, designing an anti-corruption compliance program, it's part of that valuable information that trade commissioners are providing every day to Canadian clients and are sharing with local organizations as well, not only Canadians, but also foreigners. So we discuss with companies different scenarios, and we share publicly available tools as this one, and we also refer them to other services, legal services. Some of the services that we provide, one of them is the market potential assessment. And because of our close relationship with abroad, we understand how corruption can negatively impact value and pose financial, operational, and reputational risks. Market potential assessment is part of those services. While preparing clients for international market, another of our services, this tool will play also an important role in delivering that service to Canadian clients. We work with foreign governments, with international non-government organizations, and also with communities around the world. And we direct them to relevant anti-corruption tools like this one, designing a compliance program, or others too, other tools available. As I mentioned before, besides these services, we also provide them, companies, with information on local legal environment and with qualified, relevant legal contacts in the market. Besides our standard services, the Trade Commissioner Service offers advocacy support. But companies requesting that support are required to sign an integrity declaration. This tool basically is becoming part of our prophylactic work. The Trade Commissioner helps Canadian companies who are trying to enter the international marketplace. Obviously, this e-tool with chapters by regions around the world is perfect in helping trade commissioners help their clients with a better understanding of their responsibilities in preventing global bribery. On my screen, you will see a few takeaways for companies who might be listening to this webinar in the future.
Great.
Any questions from you?
Great, Felix. Before we get to that, I just want to thank everyone who has attended the webinar. And kind of, you know, as mentioned before, we are doing this to launch our e-series, which starts on September 20th. We'll be featuring Paul Grevin from JLL, and the chapter is on the Middle East. We also have a couple exciting things coming up. On September 28th, we have our SDG Awards. And if you have any cool programs, even anti-corruption related, that helps advance the SDGs, this is your opportunity to showcase them. There will then be a public vote, and the winners will be announced at our awards on the 28th. We also have a peer review program, which gives you the opportunity for your peers to also assess your anti-corruption program if it is illustrated in your report. Yeah, so that's kind of upcoming events. Next, I'm going to open the floor to questions. We have Amy from the GC&C team who is going to ask the questions.
Hello, so this is for Pat, and it's from Laura Gagliarden. So it says, thanks for the amazing presentation and work done. How would you engage the private sector in a country where corruption is institutionalized? In my opinion, ICTs and social media can play a fundamental role in facilitating transparency and making institutions stronger.
Well, thank you for the question. Yes, I actually agree. Social media is a huge player now in terms of increasing transparency and accountability. There are certain jurisdictions that are very, very hard for businesses to operate, but the thing is, it's by increasing transparency and getting civil society involved in reporting and making, public officials more accountable will actually change the culture. It's more difficult for companies to operate in those jurisdictions, but if they are prepared, if they do their due diligence, if they have a strong compliance program and they train their people well, they will be able to mitigate those risks when they come in. But social media is a key factor. You've got places like India where you have apps that people can use to report corrupt conduct, and social media is becoming a key factor to change the culture of corruption.
Very interesting. Okay, now we've got one from Enamel for Jonathan. So he says, what is your opinion regarding the Padma Bridge gas scandal? For this false report, Bangladesh lost the World Bank investment.
Yeah, I think that, it really falls into one of the things that I was touching on, which is the impact of corruption outside of purely an enforcement action. As we look at the multilateral lending institutions, they all have their own anti-corruption arms as well as their anti-corruption due diligence processes. The World Bank and the other multilaterals, they do operate and are used to operating in developing countries and in countries where the rule of law may be weak and the risk of corruption may be high. But what we are increasingly seeing, and this is an example, is them standing up and making corruption and anti-corruption efforts a high priority for their investment and penalizing both companies as well as sometimes communities where those efforts aren't sufficient. And so I think this is something that we are not only seeing, and it's typical to see the multilaterals take a lead on this, and then the private financial institutions and the private sector follow on in terms of their own lending and financing approaches, and that is certainly something we are seeing as a trend in the lending and financing fields.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. Amy's going to respond with the next question.
Yeah, so we've got another one from Laura Gagliarden, and it's for Susan. So she is wondering, do you work with law enforcement / security organizations to raise awareness, tackle corruption in practice, and ensure sustainability? And are you going to market the ebook among law enforcement security organizations as well?
In terms of Partnership Africa-Canada, obviously our focus is not anti-corruption. It's really formalizing supply chains and conflict minerals. But we do encounter corruption in our work in the field, and one of the things that we do to help us navigate, channels that are often informal and a bit sketchy at times is really local partnerships. And, choosing local partners well and working with people in country who understand the environment and who can help us navigate this environment in a more effective way. We also do a lot of, Pat alluded to the, tools that allow citizens to report corruption. We've worked a lot doing long-term sensitization and engagement with people in country. When you're implementing initiatives, whether they're anti-corruption or other types of initiatives in countries that are highly, where corruption is rife, there needs to be some element of education and sensitization so that you have buy-in from the local population and from officials, some officials at least in that country. So it's really important to do that legwork so that whatever initiative you're trying to implement stands a chance of being successful. And this is something that PAC has done with a fair amount of success, particularly in the DRC with the Just Gold project. In terms of the ebook, I don't think that question was directed to me. I'm not sure. I guess it would be up to the Global Compact to pick up on that.
Yeah, that's good. We appreciate your insights.
Jim, Amy?
Go ahead.
Do you mind if I add a couple of comments from the enforcement perspective?
Yeah,
my primary role is outreach coordinator, so I work with industry to try to help them mitigate their risk and exposure to corruption. So I provide training and the seminar, and I also work with our partners with the International Foreign Bribery Task Force, which is the U.S., the Australian authorities, UK, and Canada. And I can tell you that there's a big emphasis in using these type of tools. And I've been promoting the ebook actually, and I've been using the ebook in some of the training. I can tell you that I've been promoting it as well with our enforcement partners because the outreach perspective, the prevention perspective is a key element in addressing corruption issues. So it's not just about arresting and investigating. We need that very strongly, but we need a balanced approach. And using these type of tools is critical to change the culture of corruption.
Great. It's good to hear that you're promoting such a useful tool. So we've got one more from Francisco, and I guess this is directed to Jonathan. So he wants to know, or she, are there any plans for a chapter about Asia and China in particular?
It's a great question. Right now, we really were focused on getting through this second phase at this point, and then we're going to take stock as to the next steps. But certainly, the concept of creating a chapter focusing on Asia and China would be obviously appropriate in light of the overall challenges in terms of operations as well as enforcement patterns. Where more cases have been filed coming out of China in the last couple of years than any other, and doing business there is very difficult given the influence of the state on virtually all business activities. There are the number of state-owned entities and state-controlled entities is really quite vast, and it means most business that you interface with there, your counterparty is going to have a government connection. So right now there aren't plans yet for additional chapters. The goal has been to get through this phase, but we certainly will go back and talk about what the next steps would be, and to the extent there are additional chapters, an Asia focus with a China emphasis would be very high on the list.
Okay, great, thanks. So that was all the questions we have for today. I wanted to thank you, the listeners, the speakers, as well as our support from GCNC to put this webinar forward. We look forward to the first session on September 20th on the Middle East. So thank you guys and have a wonderful day.